Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Every Day is Saturday. I'm Matt Stahl, along with my partner, Brad Gatto.
Hola, amigo.
Oh, nice.
I'm running out of stuff. I don't know.
That was good. That was real good. Yeah, it was better than howdy.
But that's my favorite one because Woody is my favorite Pixar character of all time.
Oh, nice. There you go. Love it. All right. We have one of our favorite types of episodes today. We do have a special guest joining us, which we'll get to shortly. Before we do that, Brad, what have you been up to?
Work. That's a very boring answer, but we've been very busy with all the education content we've been creating recently, which I'm always excited about. My passion in this industry is to educate the community around us. And so it's been a lot recently, and I've got travel coming up related to that. But 2024, we've been educators, kind of from the jump, but It just seems like this year, everything's kind of hitting that J curve, which is really, really fun, but kind of a boring answer, but a lot of it's been work. How about you?
Lots of work.
Dude, come up with if I say that, you can't say that. You don't also get a boring answer.
I started off the year with a bang with a lot of travel, getting my new project up and off the ground. And now we're kind of settling into a bit of a routine. So I'm actually going to be in Minnesota. Well, take that back. I'll be here more than I was the first quarter. Let's put it that way.
More importantly, what the listeners really want to know is, did you file your taxes?
I filed an extension.
I didn't know the answer to that question, but I did. So that was kind of a jerk question.
To be fair, everything was prepared except for one thing that I'm dependent upon one other person.
It's not me, is it?
It's not you.
Okay. I was going to say, wow, you can just throw that knife right back at me.
I did not. It was not you.
Awesome. So you teased that we have a guest here today. And so you also said that it's one of our favorite types of episodes when we get to have a guest. I would argue that not only having a guest is our favorite type of episode, but like from a topic perspective, behavioral finance is our favorite topic.
Absolutely.
And we get the mass intersection of that today.
Yeah, it's like we're kind of maybe not even minor league players. We're like high school baseball players that are getting to sit down with a major league player.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And now he has to live up to it.
Yeah. There you go.
He plays for the St. Louis Cardinals, everybody. We have Dr. Daniel Crosby on the show with us today. I'm just going to call you Daniel, if that's okay.
I'm AAA at best. I
don't know. You just released your fourth book. I think that gets you. I think that's major league.
Gets you to the show?
Yeah. Well, if AAA is your third book, the fourth book has to be.
Yeah.
Well, so technically that doesn't come out quite yet. We'll talk about that one. So maybe you are in AAA. But that being said, Mr. Crosby, Daniel, thanks for joining us today. For the listeners, Daniel is the Chief Behavioral Officer for Orion, a best-selling author. His book, Personal Benchmark, was a New York Times bestseller. He's got a couple other books, The Laws of Wealth, The Behavioral Investor, and coming this October, we'll talk about this more later, another book called The Soul of Wealth that we're excited about. It's actually sitting on my desk. And so that being said, here to talk a little bit more about behavioral finance, which is a big topic of ours if you're a follower of the show, as you know. Daniel, tell us a little bit. First of all, let's start with the better stuff. Tell us about your family.
Yeah. So I'm married, just hit 18 years of bliss with my wife. We have 3 kids. We got a kid in high school. We have a kid in 4th grade and a kid in 1st grade. So we're at.
Oh wow! You're spanning some time.
We're all over the place, but they're all at fun ages, and family is everything for me, and it's the best part of my everyday. So I feel very blessed to have the family that I do. Yeah. So that's
18 years, but you got one in high school. How old in high school?
14.
So 14-year-old. So you got a freshman all the way down to a 1st grader.
Yeah, freshman to a 1st grader. That's right.
As a behavioral finance guy, was that purposeful? Like you're trying to manage, child behavior, and you knew developmentally.
No. Lots of trouble getting them here is the short answer. Okay. So lots of trouble getting them here. I wouldn't have done it that way on purpose, but I'm glad they're here.
And you live in the Atlanta area, correct?
Yeah, I live in the suburbs of Atlanta, yes.
But you went to school at BYU and Emory, and I have also been told you're a St. Louis Cardinals baseball fan. Where you live, your fandom for baseball, and where you went to college, there's no triangulation there. So give me a little bit of that backstory.
Okay, so it is a good story. So I grew up in North Alabama, lived there, my whole life until I went to school. I'm Mormon, so there's like 7 Mormons in Alabama. I'm one of them. So I went. so that's why I went to BYU. The Cardinals fandom is explainable. My grandpa grew up in Texas, in the middle of nowhere.
So far, you're getting further away. I don't.
Before there were Texas teams. And so the only radio station he got on his ranch in Texas was KMOX out of St. Louis. So my grandpa grew up a massive Cardinals fan. My dad's from California, a Cardinals fan. I'm from Alabama and a Cardinals fan. So yeah, here I am, went to BYU and Emory, a Southern Mormon dude who likes the Cardinals.
Makes perfect sense. I don't know why I didn't put that together.
Shame on you. Oh, and incidentally, this could be a sore spot, but deep hatred for the Twins. Deep hatred. Like the 1987 Twins made 7-year-old Daniel cry. The Kent Herbeck, Frank Viola, Kirby Puckett Twins did me dirty in Game 7 of the World Series. I've never forgiven the state of Minnesota for that.
That was on the other side.
You know what though? If it makes you feel any better, they wanted to get in '91. That is, we are the smallest major market with all 4 sports: baseball, basketball, football, hockey. Mm-hmm. That was the last championship any of our 4 major men's teams have won.
Yeah.
Now we have women's teams that are winning, but from a men's perspective, 91 was it. So
it would appear my prayers are being answered, and the curse
Wow. So all of that doesn't shed any light on how you get into behavioral finance and end up being the chief behavioral officer for a firm as big as Orion. So now carry us through to that part of the story.
Yeah. So my dad is a financial advisor. He still is a practicing financial advisor. He's my advisor. And so my dad, I grew up in a home where we were talking about financial planning and stock selection and investing around the dinner table. And my dad, treats his job like a calling. He's a fantastic advisor. So when I went to school with an eye my freshman year to being like my dad. Like I was going to be a financial advisor. I was going to do something with investment management. But after my freshman year, I went on a mission for my church. And so I spent 2 years in the Philippines. And when you're a kid from Alabama who finds himself 8,000 miles away speaking Tagalog and living in Southeast Asia, there are cultural differences that immediately...
You don't say.
Yeah, I know this is surprising. But the differences in culture and values and beliefs and all this was just so fascinating to me. So I got back from my missionary experience 2 years later, and I said, I've got to study people. And so I went into psychology. So I got my bachelor's in psychology, and I started my PhD 3 days after I finished my bachelor's degree. So I was 23 years old. I'm getting my PhD. And about halfway through my PhD program in clinical psychology, I just burned out. It was stressing me out to a level that I just couldn't be effective because I was taking work home with me. I mean, I was meeting with people with very serious problems. Some of them were court ordered, it was just really we won't go into it. It was very heavy stuff. And I came to my dad, who's an advisor, as I was finishing my PhD, because I was like, look, I'm going to finish. I've come this far. I'm going to finish. I'm going to get the DR in front of the name. But I came to my dad and I said, look, I love studying human behavior. I love it. It's endlessly fascinating to me, but I don't need to be, working with dudes who went to prison because of their abnormal psychology. Is there a non-clinical, non-medical way that I could apply my love of psychology? And my dad goes, well, there's a ton of psychology in my work. Now, my dad did not know the words behavioral finance, right? But he knew that a big part of his job was keeping clients' emotions under wraps, keeping people in their seat, and being sort of a pseudo counselor to the people he served. So that comment, to make a much longer story shorter, that comment from my dad put me on a path to begin to explore finance and financial applications of my training. And what I've tried to do and where I've had some success is being sort of a translator between the ivory tower and advisors who are doing the work every day, right? There was great work being done, right? When I started to dig into this, like they're giving out Nobel Prizes for things. But at the time, the Nobel Prize winning research wasn't trickling down to people like my dad, who needed that information to work with their clients every day. So that's kind of the gap that I've tried to fill and how I got in there.
That's not interesting at all.
No. Yeah.
Well, fascinating. Just because of the way you were brought up, this huge component of having your dad in the finance industry, and then this mission that you're on halfway around the globe, and you fall in love with people and how people think, and then how those two things mash up later, and then to find such a need for it that had started at the institutional level or at the highest of highs, but yet wasn't getting down to where it could practically be applied. Right. Can you talk, and I don't want to put you on the spot here, but can you talk about that? Can you talk about like it starting Nobel Prize, type work being done in this area? Do you know a lot of the history of that? Because I'm really curious, like why they even started delving into it and kind of what that was looking like and what you found that wasn't making it down to the average advisor.
Yeah. So if you look at like the early bright lights in the field, we just lost one of them a couple of weeks ago, Daniel Kahneman, right? So people like Daniel Kahneman and Richard Thaler, right? Kahneman is a psychologist, Thaler is an economist. But, if you look at like Thaler, who did some of the early work, he's an economist. And one of the basic assumptions of economic theory is that people are utility maximizing, which is just a fancy way of saying people act in their own best interests, right? People are going to maximize the utility in their lives. They're going to make decisions that serve them well. And Thaler's like looking around everywhere and going, where are these people who are always kind of making, where are these people who are making sort of utility maximizing decisions about, whatever, sex, money, food, all the litany of sort of human trials, right? And so he looks around and he begins to catalog these deviations from expected utility and runs into Kahneman and Tversky, who are doing similar work, right? Kahneman had actually been assigned to the Israeli military. One of his early studies that was sort of well known was he found they were in the Air Force, right, watching the Israeli Air Force, and they found like a pilot would execute like a great move, right? Perfect loop-de-loop or whatever. They would land, and
that's what they called it.
They love
military terminology, loop-de-loop.
That's a technical term. So they do execute this perfect move. They come down and their commanding officer is like, wow, great job. You did it. Perfect loop-de-loop, great job, and then the next move would not be as good. And they go, oh, well, our compliments are making these guys soft. That was kind of the prevailing thing. And Kahneman comes in here and studies it and says, no, you're not making guys soft by being kind to them. It's just mean reversion. And then starts to apply that to the world of finance, which is, of course, absolutely everywhere in finance. So then Thaler and Kahneman and Tversky and all these guys get together and start publishing this work. And it's absolutely heretical, right? Like it's absolutely, they're considered insane at first because all of this stuff flies in the face of sort of the accepted dogma of the time. But those were the folks who really got us started. And Kahneman was the first to win a Nobel Prize. He won in, I believe it was 2002. So, by the time I'm looking at this stuff, it's like 2007, 2008. So it's out there, but it has effectively no presence in the lives of, everyday advisors.
Still not that old. I mean, just even 2002. I mean, I don't know. I guess you said we should have had a clue because you were talking about the Israeli military and fighter jets. Mm-hmm. So for whatever reason, my brain was going much older.
Yeah.
Even though your story of fighter jets doesn't jive with they didn't even exist with where my head was.
You had us in Wright Brothers territory. No, it hasn't been that long.
For sure.
So it has to be I mean, the little that we know about behavioral finance, it's sometimes entertaining to take that to the real world and observe it. So what are the biases that you see most, day in and day out?
Yeah. So my book, The Behavioral Investor, the whole sort of point of that book was this is a question that I think that's tossed around a lot. And what happens is the universe of biases, Thaler was sort of the first to start to diagnose these, but the universe of biases got so enormous that now I think there's over 200. And so what I did, and that's not very useful, right? Like you all know, if a client comes in first day, you go, hey, welcome to welcome. We're happy to serve you. Look, there's 200 ways you can screw this up. So like, let's just try, let's try and avoid these 200 things. And when you look at this universe of biases, a lot of them sort of load onto the same meta concepts. Mm-hmm. And so what I did in The Behavioral Investor was I took these 200-ish and I said, look, they basically boil down to like 4 that covered 90+% of the waterfront of bad decisions. And it's ego, emotion, attention, and conservatism. So I'll go through each of those real quick. Ego is the various flavors of overconfidence, right? Most of the time when we think about overconfidence, we think I'm better at X than the next guy, right? Something like 90% of people think they're better than average drivers, which is, not how average is.
We've actually brought that up before many times.
Yeah. But one of the studies I cite, it was a study of a couple hundred men that I cite in the Laws of Wealth. Let me see if I get this right. So 95% of them thought they were funnier than average. 100% of them thought they were friendlier than average. And 94% of them thought they were better looking than average.
Wow.
And the researchers say the average man thinks he's 2 sit-ups away from dating a supermodel. It's like the best line. That's sort of the most common form of
I'm pretty humble. I'm 3.
That's sort of the most common form of overconfidence, but there's also a couple other kinds. There's one where we think we know more about the future than we actually do. And then there's one where we're over optimistic. If you survey 100 married couples and say, hey, do you think you'll get divorced? Like effectively 0% of them will say yes, but 37% of them will get divorced. And you say, do you think you'll win the lottery? Yes. Do you think you'll get cancer? No. Cancer, there's a lot more cancer than lottery winners. So people tend to own things that are optimistic and delegate things that are dangerous. That's a form of overconfidence as well. So ego is like sort of the various flavors of overconfidence. Emotion is just what it sounds like, the tendency for us to make heart-led rather than head-led decisions with our money. Attention is confusing things that are loud with things that are likely. Shark attacks, recessions, things like this. We have a correction on average once a year, like over the last 100 years, but the news talks about it like it never happens. So this is sort of the media thing, is attention. And then conservatism is the asymmetrical relationship between our risk and reward preferences, right? We're a lot more upset about losing $100 than we are happy about gaining $100. And there's a host of other things, right? Status quo bias and things that sort of load onto this conservatism. We like what we know, we like to play it safe, and we don't like to lose. And all of this kind of leads us to hold too much cash, not take enough risk, over-index on things like home country bias. Those are all sort of flavors of excessive conservatism. Those are really the big 4, though, of the 200 odd ones that there are.
We'll definitely have to have you back because I would gladly listen to you go through all 200, especially if you had great examples like you did.
Could you recite all 200 of them?
I mean, I couldn't. If you ask me what they are, I could tell you what it is, but I couldn't just spout all 200 in alphabetically. Yeah.
I want to make sure we at least get a couple practical things for people to walk away with, but I want to end with that. So before that, and Matt, I'm sure you have other questions too, but for like you and your dad, you said your dad's your advisor. So you have this background, right? You know all this stuff. Your dad you said, is a great advisor. It's a passion for him. How does this affect your guys' conversations? I mean, I'm sure there's an additional dynamic of father-son there, but if you try to extrapolate that out and just kind of look at it from the perspective of you have your background and he has his, I'm just curious how this practically plays out in your relationship.
So I'm laughing because I just got off the phone with my dad, and we were just talking about my account and how the stock market keeps going down. People will sometimes ask me, like, why do you have an advisor? Well, one obvious reason is because it's my dad, but the other reason, but more broadly than that, it's like, why does someone who's written 4 books on how to manage money and how to act with money, not just DIY? Why don't I save? Because I pay my dad. Like, why don't I just save the money and open up an E-Trade account and do it myself? And the reason is, and Daniel Kahneman spoke to this very nicely, there's this huge knowing doing gap. Okay, so my favorite example of this, which is kind of sad, but doctors and nurses smoke at a dramatically higher rate than the general population. So doctors are slightly higher. Nurses are way higher. Like nurses smoke at like double the clip of the, general population. Yeah. And if you ask a nurse, hey, should you be doing that? To a person, they would tell you no. Like no nurse is going to be like, oh, crap, this is bad for me. Nobody's surprised by the fact that cigarette smoking is bad for you, right? Least of all nurses, but they have stressful jobs and they have weird hours and they're underpaid and their work is wonky. Like they're stressed out. So that's why they smoke. It's not because they don't know any better. And when I think about me and money, it's the same thing, right? Like I've written 4 books about being unemotional with your money. But when it comes to my money, I am as emotional as the next person, right? Like I could tell you 2 exactly what to do with your money. But when it comes to my money and my account, I'm just as stupid as the next person. And so I pay my dad good money because he is a behavioral buffer between me and a bad choice.
Yeah.
Right? Like I could write 100 books on this and I wouldn't need him any less. Just in the same way that a personal trainer is a powerful advocate, right? Like we all know how to lose weight, right? Eat less, move more, and yet there's lots of people need help, myself included, right? So it's like the knowing is the easy part, the doing is the hard part. And if you have someone in your corner who can help you execute, it's worth the money.
You should just record that.
We are recording it.
Share it over and over again.
And you don't have to answer this, but I'm going to dive into that just a little bit more. So like today, when you were talking to him, does he have to like remind you like during these conversations of like, hey man, like you're literally not practicing what you preach here kind of conversations?
The literal last thing he said to me 10 minutes before I joined y'all on this call was, calm down, you're going to be okay. Because, I am telling you, it does not help. It does not help to write a book. In fact, the fact that I'm doing 3 podcasts today, right? So the fact that I'm do so many speaking gigs and public appearances and things like this, I have to kind of keep my finger on the pulse of the market in a way that I wouldn't if I were like a normie, a school teacher or something where I could just go live my life and kind of forget about the markets. I sort of have to like be neck deep in markets at all time. Yeah. And it's, you shouldn't be, right? I mean, you should like set it and forget it. And so the fact that my dad has to talk me off a ledge with great regularity, and he shouldn't, but he does. So I keep paying him.
I love it.
So this is a relatively new discipline, or whatever word we used earlier, right? What are you most excited about when you think about where we are today and think about the future? Mm-hmm. What are the things that you think about that get you the most excited?
That is a great question. I love that question. So at the risk of getting a little geeky, like if you look at
you can get as geeky as you want. Yeah. Go for it.
If you look at the trajectory of psychology more broadly, we started with studying brokenness, right? We started studying like why your mom messed you up and, why you've got all this disorders and this anxiety and depression. Freud, Wilhelm Wundt, like all those guys who started early, it was all the study of brokenness and dysfunction. Mm-hmm. Behavioral finance started just the same way, right? It was like, here's all the ways you get it wrong, right? Like, here's all the goofy, wacky things you do with your money. Look at you, how dumb, and there's a place for that, right? Because, as I write about in my books, right, like you need to understand this universe of misbehavior so you can create risk management procedures and the like that protect against it. But what's next in the 90s? Like, it wasn't until the 90s, because, psychology is only a couple hundred years old, right? Behavioral finance is 40 years old. Psychology is, 200 years old. So it was not until the 1990s that we saw the emergence of what's called positive psychology, which is the study of, not what makes people broken and fallible and screwed up, but what makes people thrive, right? Like what's the science of human flourishing? What's the science of greatness, of happiness, of great relationships, good marriages, great corporate leaders, great leaders on the battlefield or on the court, right? And so that discipline is 35 years old. The study of what makes people great is 35 years old. And that's where I and others are trying to take behavioral finance, right? And so, shameless plug, the new book, The Soul of Wealth, which you have 6 months before anyone else can get it, right? The Soul of Wealth is all about that. Money and meaning, money and thriving, charity, philanthropy, having enough, right? Being sufficient, like self-sufficiency, adequacy. That's where I think the puck is going. That's a Minnesota reference. That's where I think the puck is.
Nice.
That's for y'all. I don't know what hockey is, but I threw that in for you.
Neither of us is hockey players, but we're both from Iowa.
State, you nailed it.
You nailed it.
I tried.
Yeah, we grew up. The joke I always tell is we grew up in Iowa, and in Iowa they spell hockey wrestling. So I love that. I love the change, but it's also fascinating to me. And this goes back to like human behavior. We studied the negative side of it first. Yeah. And then 150, 180 years later, somebody's like, hey, we should probably look at the positive side of this, right. And do a little bit more homework on that. Talk to me a little bit. So I'm going to get a little bit practical. And this is typically a topic we avoid, but this is me purposely trying to dive in and like hit one of the biggest problems on its head. Because as advisors, we get you get the people all the time that are just like, well, this is why I am doing what I'm doing because of this fact or these 3 facts that are unique to the world today. Or this is why I'm not willing to get into the market because this shoe is going to drop or this is going to happen and I don't like this. And there's always things you could point to that seem abnormal or different or whatever it may be. One of the most hotly contested. And so when you said I have to keep my pulse in the markets and all that kind of stuff, all I could think about is we're in an election year. Mm-hmm. I hope this doesn't make people mad. It is one of the most annoying things as a financial advisor is that we have to talk about how their opinion of the election and based on that opinion and whatever side of the aisle they fall on is going to so greatly impact what they want to do with their money. So can you just speak to the behavioral aspect of that or maybe some practical application, how to think through that?
Yeah, there's great charts that show the growth of the stock market during both red and blue presidencies, right? And in both red and blue presidencies, it's up and to the right. But what we also see is when you ask people how the economy is doing, right? So like you think right now, right, we have a Democratic president. If you ask Republicans on average, how's the economy doing? They would say very badly. Well, that's not true. Right. Like objectively, that's not true. And the reverse is true when the other guys are in power. Right. I'm not picking on anybody. We see this, that people tend to view the economy through the lens of whether or not their preferred party is in power. it's one of the most corrosive things you can do with your money is to try and invest alongside your politics. And we are more fragmented than we have ever been before. Like, this is well documented, right? Like, the parties are polarizing. And I think with that increasing polarization comes a desire to stay out of the market. And we actually shared, I wish I had the stats. When I come back, I'll bring the specific stats. But we looked at stats earlier this year in a webinar I did with our chief investment officer. We looked at some stats, and people whose non-preferred party was in power underperformed the people whose preferred party was in power dramatically every year, both parties. And the reasons were twofold. One is they took less risk because they're like, hey, my person isn't in power. It's time to go to cash, right? Like, it's time to take some chips off the table because my person isn't in power. So of course there's drag there. They underperform. And then the other thing was they tended to allocate outside of the US in greater numbers, which again, the US, I mean, I'm a big believer in investing all over the world, but the US has had a really nice run for many years. And what a lot of people did was they would go, oh, well, I'm taking my money to Europe because my guy's not in power, like, that sort of thing. And, they underperformed because of that historically. So it's one of the most tempting, but one of the most damaging things you could do. You need a plan that doesn't, depend on who's in power. Yep. And, I talk about in The Soul of Wealth, investing is an act of optimism. It's a belief that tomorrow will be brighter than today. And that is true in general. People, even the people you don't like, right? They didn't get out of bed to blow the world up. And the world is headed to a better, safer, more prosperous place. And investing is a bet on a brighter future.
Well said.
Yeah. Coincidentally, that's where part of the name Fiat came from. Was we launched in 2009. And it was the interpretation we took was to have faith that things will go on. And just that, believing that tomorrow will be better than today. So, love it.
In one of my books, I wrote that the most powerful words in investing are "this too shall pass," right? Because in March of 2009, where it feels like there's just dark shadows everywhere, you have to be able to say to yourself, "This too shall pass," right? There is a future beyond this great financial crisis. Yeah. And in some more recent years, when we've had just like astounding, incredible, 20-30% returns, you also have to tell yourself, this too shall also pass. Like, it's not always going to be like this. It's human nature to take the recent past. It's recency bias, right? Like, it's human nature to take the recent past and extrapolate it into the future indefinitely. And in markets, the exact opposite tends to be true, right? If you had a really rough year, typically means the better years are ahead. And if you had a really incredible run of years, it's probably going to get a little lean in the years ahead. So we really have to help people overcome that tendency to think like, what's happened over the last 60 days, it's all that will ever happen.
One more question before we wrap up, because I know we're getting close to time here, but if you could give one piece of, like, if you could only give one piece of advice to investors, knowing everything that you know, and that was it, you couldn't say anything else, what do you think is like the most important? The one thing that everybody just has to at least know, whether they act on it or not. And I loved what you said, the difference between knowing and doing and the gap there, right? But what do they at least need to know or understand?
Can I negotiate for two pieces of advice?
Oh boy. Yeah. I mean, you're asking for 100% increase.
The first thing I would say is automate, right? So going back to that knowing doing gap, most of the most powerful behavioral interventions that we know of in the world of finance have something to do with automating good behavior, right? Mm-hmm. And the brilliant thing about automation is it allows us to use a weakness and make it a strength. So human beings are lazy, forgetful, and status quo prone. So if you have not started saving, your laziness, forgetfulness, and status quo proneness is going to lead you to continue to not do those things. But if you start a program of saving and investing, lock it in and throw away the key through automation, your laziness and forgetfulness will tend to automate that positive behavior, right? So that would be if you could only do one thing, it's like automate a process of saving and investing so that you never have to think about it or even see it. And you can sort of just lock in that good behavior. The second thing that I would say is to get a trusted counselor, a trusted advisor. Chapter 2 of my book, In the Laws of Wealth, is all about this. And it's really just such a powerful thing. People who work with an advisor dramatically outperform those who don't. And when you look at the reasons why, this blows people's minds. It has nearly nothing to do with asset allocation or stock selection. It is because that advisor has kept that person from engaging in like 3 to 5 catastrophic screw-ups over the lifetime of their relationship. When the son-in-law wants you to invest in his non-alcoholic beer company, or when
that's a very specific example.
I know. There's a reason for that. So when the son-in-law wants you to invest in his beverage company, right? Like when it's March of 2009 or March of 2020, and you're just freaking out and you can't see a future, if your advisor keeps you in your seat or prevents you from making a big, a big mess up, a big goof like that, you will never pay them back, right? Like the fees you pay that advisor will never compensate them for the added value. So automate everything you can, work with someone you trust. And that's the second one I negotiated for.
Love it. Great advice.
It's great.
I know you have to run. And so I greatly appreciate you taking the time to be on the podcast today. Love the conversation. I just love how you explain things. It's super simple, but it's also super important. And so I also just want to thank you for what you're doing in our industry in trying to bring some of that work that was done 20 plus years ago down to the average lay advisor, because it's only going to help the average consumer at the end of that rainbow. And so appreciate what you do, not just for the industry as a whole, but for Orion, who we work with specifically, because we get to be a part of the work that you're doing. And so that's pretty awesome. So thanks for being here with us today.
No, it's my pleasure. Thanks, guys.
And we did mention you do have a new book coming out in October. Do you know the exact date?
Yeah, it's October 15th. It's the day before my birthday. I try and release all my books on my birthday, as close to my birthday as I can, so I get a nice royalty check every birthday.
There you go. Nice. I like it. So October 15th, The Soul of Wealth by Dr. Daniel Crosby. If you want to look up the other books that he's written, Personal Benchmark, The Laws of Wealth, and The Behavioral Investor. Personal Benchmark, like I said, was a New York Times bestseller. Tons of great information in those other 2 books as well, though. Enjoyed The Laws of Wealth. And so, Dr. Crosby, thanks for joining us here today. For those of you who are listening, thanks for joining us for another episode of Every Day is Saturday. I'm Brad Gatto here with my co-host, Matt Stahl. Thanks for joining us. If you need any more information on anything we talked about today or fiat in general, you can find all of that at our website. That's fiatwm.com, fiatwm.com. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you all next Saturday.
Thank you for listening to Every Day is Saturday. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Fiat Wealth Management. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning.